Okay, thank you. Hello. Once again, I'm Catherine Copper from the Eberhard Zeidler Library at the University of Toronto. So that's the Library for Architecture, Landscape, and Design. And in my role, I liaise with the Architecture and Visual Arts Department. So the project I'm going to be sharing with you today is a project I worked on with the art and architecture students, and then I'll conclude with some ideas I have about the implications of AI and this type of learning for students on our library collections. So this was an internally funded project at the University of Toronto. We have LEAF funding, it's Learning, Education, and Advancement Funds. And it would have been a year ago, the university sent out a call specifically looking for AI projects. This was, of course, around the same time that the library was sending a very clear message, like that they wanted us to be investigating, exploring AI. So I thought it would be a great opportunity to get some funding and kind of see where it went. And when I was applying for this funding, I was thinking a lot of libraries are going to be looking at this from like the research synthesis point of view. And as an art and architecture librarian, I thought, well, perhaps I should focus on the image tools, right? The generative text to image AI tools. So that was my focus. And this was the project description that I had submitted. So image generation software like DALL-E and Midjourney is revolutionizing the fields of art and architecture as a tool to quickly create visual representations. In education, it helps explore concepts more quickly. This was very specifically what I was looking at, like the kind of concept exploration. This project helps to inform developing artists and architects how to ethically use AI in image research, how research outcomes differ between AI and traditional research methods, and then lastly, maybe most importantly, how to critically think about the image that is created. So again, I was coming to this as an architecture and art librarian. This was one of many items. You could have pulled any item off our shelf. They're all very visual and image heavy, and many of our students and faculty are coming to the library to do image research, right? They'll get a assignment, a prompt, design a school, a museum, a pavilion. They all like to design pavilions. They come to the library looking for that inspiration. So when I started to think of these text-to-image tools, for me it was a question of, well, if they can just go to DALL-E or Midjourney and get inspiration, and very personalized information at that, then what is the role of the library? And it wasn't that it was a new iteration of image research, it was just a different iteration that could go along with the kind of traditional use of the library. Okay, so that was the prompt or the proposal that I had submitted. I ended up working with a first-year course at Daniels, that's our faculty's name, and it was a computation and design course. So this is a first-year course. Every student coming into Daniels has to take this course, whether they're architecture or visual arts, landscape. And traditionally it had been taught as really a coding course, so how to use coding for design. And the year, this would have been last fall, that I partnered with the faculty, it was really starting, Paul Howard Harrison is who I worked with, and he was really starting to think of not what can computation do, but what can't computation do, and to get the students to think of it in that sense. So, I'm trying to line up my slides and my notes here, so bear with me. We drew heavily on the book The New Dark Age by James Bridle, in which he says, "It is increasingly necessary to be able to think of new technologies in different ways and to be critical of them in order to meaningfully participate in their shaping and directing." So again, we were both coming at this, first-year students wanting to teach them to be critical. If they're going to use these tools, we know they are, then what should they be thinking about? James Bridle goes on to say, learning to code is not enough. And then even further, a simply functional understanding of systems is insufficient. One needs to be able to think of the histories and consequences too. Where did these systems come from? Who designed them and what for? And which of these intentions still lurk within them today? So these In addition to my kind of project proposal, it was to teach the students to be critical and to teach them how to understand the way that these systems work. The course was broken up into 3 modules. So the library primarily partnered with the module 1, where they were teaching artificial intelligence. Later on through the semester, they started to learn logarithmic design and designing with code, specifically using these tools. So in module 1, this was the assignment that we had worked on. It was called 1,000 Words, drawing on the, saying a picture's worth 1,000 words. And what we asked them to do was select an image of architecture, whether representation or photography, so this could be any image that they chose, and to think critically about the image. What does it mean? How did it relate to the in-class discussions? Then they had to use any text-to-image AI model and recreate that image as closely as possible using a text-based prompt. That was part 1. Part 2, once they had gotten as close as they could to that original image, take that exact prompt and put it into a different text-to-image model so that then they can start to kind of pull out the bias and how the 2 different tools create images differently. So just that. How do the 2 images differ? How are they similar? Bias, and then submit a 100-word narrative. And I'll go through some student examples in a minute. So part of the internal funding that I had received helped to create an image, a research guide, essentially. I used LibGuides, and it funded a graduate student who helped to populate the guide with examples and some context. And then we taught portions of the guide in the course. So we lectured on prompt engineering, for example. So the guide itself covers 4 things. The first being how to use AI. We knew a lot of first-year students would be coming in that fall wanting to use AI. So we wanted to make the information immediately accessible to them and all in one place. We wanted to touch on how these AI tools work. Third, talk about how students can go about critically evaluating them, so giving them a sort of framework and things to be thinking about, and then providing them with a list of resources. So pulling from the guide, the first section on how to use AI included workflow tutorial videos on a couple of different topics. The first being that concept exploration that I was talking about. So how do you use AI to explore different concepts? And to show, we really stressed to show the process and the tracking and the different iterations as you go through exploring the concepts. And that comes up again, and just kind of a key takeaway is really breaking up the process when you're using these tools in assignments. Then we included tutorials on in-painting, generative fill. I was a little hesitant to do this at the beginning because I thought it wasn't the library's role to teach how to design with these tools, but the faculty I worked with and the graduate assistant felt it was important to have all the information in one spot for the students, so we did. And then this section of prompt engineering we really worked on. The first image on my first slide, the kind of architecture of Gaudi, which we had done a year ago, and then I happened to be presenting in Barcelona. But that was from the first iteration of the prompt engineering page, which it was kind of one sentence, create an architecture style of Gaudi with in the photographic style of Juan Bon, for example. And since then, the prompt engineering section has really evolved to talk about the different weights depending on where you put the adjective to the subject, using commas, quotes. It all can affect the image that you get as an output. Then for the second portion of the guide, we talk a high-level overview of how these models function. So really with the goal of shedding light on the training process so that students better understand that putting in text and getting out an image is not a magic wand. There really is kind of a computer system that is doing this. So for example, in the diffusion model, it's trained on many, many images. It breaks them down into little pixels, all images of dogs. Then you want to recreate a dog, it takes all those pixels and recreates. So kind of walking them through that process so that they understand how it works. The third portion of the guide, teaching students to use it ethically. So we used this example of just really how these tools perpetuate bias. We put in a color photograph of an architect, and you can see, I'm sure even from the back, that it's very white in the images versus a color photograph of a housekeeper. So very clearly indicating to the students, like, these tools are very biased. We then also talked through some examples of generative AI art. Image on the left, which we considered exhibited originality and process. So this was an AI-generated image that won an art competition, very controversial, but could you not argue that it's still very original and beautiful? Versus on the right, malicious uses, so kind of initiating this broader discussion for the students of accuracy, deepfakes, and copyright. So this is a graphic artist. These are not AI created, but people were recreating it, and by using these AI images that were recreated based on his work, it devalued the original art. So those kind of like ethical considerations for the students. And then finally, a list of resources so that students knew, this is what I want to do, this is a tool I can use to do it. So as far as student learning outcomes with the assignment, they were very interesting. There were a number of students that were able to produce really successful images, and they got very specific. The original image on the left, the AI-generated image on the right, they got very specific with their prompts without saying kind of what the original building was and where it was located. So for example, I mean, they really clearly recreated the foreground, the perspective of the building, the colors of the building. So we thought this was kind of a positive student outcome. And then also in the narrative portion, it was a great place for the students to kind of figure out like why these tools and what they were good at and what they weren't. This is an example of a text-to-image tool being very good at being able to replicate certain typologies. So if you put in school, you get something that really looks like a school. So this was another well-done student example. But some of the biggest takeaways were actually in what we, I guess you would consider the unsuccessful outcomes, where the images didn't really look exactly like the original image. And this is where students were really able to reflect on the kind of data set bias that these tools were trained on. So the original image being by Indigenous architect Douglas Cardinal, and then the AI recreated image where it was like you can clearly see that like these tools are not trained on a lot of Indigenous architecture. Like it doesn't get it in the same way that it could recreate a school. Okay, and then it culminated in a collaborative exhibition. So we put this on a digital screen right outside the library where we showed examples of the student work, and it was kind of like a guessing game for anybody coming through the hall there. We put up the student examples, which is real. They got 20 seconds to kind of figure out which one was real and which one was AI generated. And then a link to the guide will pop up at the end. So in this way, we're communicating also to the people who weren't in this course, like the library is interested in this. We've created a guide, please check it out. Like we're talking about AI. So feedback on all of this, we sent out a form following the assignment to the students in the course. There were 300 students in the course, and we had over 200 students respond, so it was pretty good return, and so fairly accurate, we felt, in the feedback that we collected. We asked them to rank the sections in the guide from most useful to least useful, and they ranked prompt engineering and critically evaluating the AI tools as most useful. This was good news to me because going into the project, I felt like these were the two areas the library could provide the most value. We then also asked them to, how useful were these sections of the guide, and more than half of the students all said that it was either very or extremely useful, so they liked the guide. Now, when we asked what information was missing from the guide, most people said nothing. But roughly 10% of the responses offered suggestions for more improvements, and these were more discussions around the limitations. I mean, these are young first-year students, but they want to understand, like, what can't these tools do? What bias, how do we combat the bias of these tools? Like, they're very eager, they want to know. They wanted more examples. They wanted us to work on that prompt engineering section, which we since have really put a lot of time and effort into. And they want examples, like real life examples, so real artists that have used this, real architects that have used it. And that's still like the set to draw from is still very small in that regard. So to date, the guide has received over 15,000 views. In comparison to the other research guides I manage, like there is no comparison. This has gotten a lot of attention. Outside researchers wanting to share their ideas, people wanting to reuse some of the images in here. So it's received a lot of positive feedback. What's next? I'll continue to work with the faculty at Daniels. Like I had indicated before, we're really focused on assignments that follow the process. So we don't care so much about the end result anymore. We want to know how you got there. And on that same note, as the librarian, I'm really trying to push for students to credit work. So if you're using images that inspire you, like credit that, which I don't see a lot in architecture and art so much as it's happening in the sciences. So I think we can really start to push that. Creative research still requires that traditional research. You still have to understand the ideas, the theories of architecture and art, even just to prompt these systems. Like you have to have an understanding of the bigger, broader themes. Faculty and librarian collaborations. I presented this at a faculty conference, so this point was really for them, but always I've had great takeaways when I work with faculty. And then for all of you, I feel like the library is in a unique position to curate and manage AI object repositories. So this is really where I'm starting to shift my focus. This is from Dimensions.com. It's a comprehensive reference database of dimension drawings. So for our architecture students, they can go in and just get standard dimensions, layouts of typical rooms. But I'm using this as sort of inspiration for what would a digital object database look like? What would more multimedia collections look like? Can libraries manage things like this? For example, this is a new text to 3D tool, so we're no longer just talking about 2D images, now we're moving into 3D. It's called Luma AI. And then I start to think of like, okay, all the outputs that are gonna come out of this, right? I had put in a modern laneway house. You get a few models to choose from. Pick the one you like. It's a very, very rough rendering, but you can then pull this into your design software and start to build on it. So thinking of like, what are these AI outputs and how to kind of grow a traditional, what we would consider image collection so that they're now more multimedia and including 3D objects. And for example, Zaha Hadid Architects had worked on a project architecting the metaverse. This was an installation, crossed architecture, art, and technology. And so if this is kind of the output of that, right, like we're architecting things that don't actually live as a physically built environment, but a digitally built environment. You know, how are we archiving and curating these collections as objects? And or, as librarians, we have a lot of collections of images, multimedia, maybe objects. Is it part of our role then to contribute to the data set that these are trained on, even if it's just internally for our users to use? So I will leave you with that, a QR link to the guide, and thank you so much for your attention in this talk.